First, I want to thank Jerry and the city for that terrific plaque. It means a lot to me. I was totally surprised by this. I feel like I'm having a Sally Fields moment, like you like me, you really like me.
We do.
I was tasked to talk about a kind of nerdy subject, which is this twin deficits. And my goal is to get you on board. There's a certain group of people who think of this as trivial and obvious, but the vast majority of people don't really understand that. One person who doesn't understand it is Peter Navarro, who is sort of the most famous Californian in the last couple of days because he's been getting a tremendous amount of press because of his role in the Trump trade policy. And he's pushed out Gary Cohn, as a matter of fact. I think Gary Cohn understands the twin deficits. The twin deficits are the federal deficit and the external deficit. And twin means that if the federal government borrows another dollar, that money is going to come from foreign sources and create an external deficit. So in a sense, what the twin deficits are saying is that we finance that tax reduction on the corporate side by borrowing from the Chinese. And that has huge long-term consequences that we might want to talk about at some point. But I just want to get across this idea of the twin deficits. And I noticed that yesterday we had this New York Times article, Trump hates a trade deficit, but most economists don't. And this is what Joseph Gagnon says about it. The first line says, if you look across countries, there's no evidence that high tariffs reduce your trade deficit. So even though the focus of Navarro and Trump is on deficits, and particularly bilateral deficits between the United States and Mexico and the United States and China, these remedies that they imagined, are tariff remedies, don't actually matter. And certainly the historical evidence doesn't support that. That's the first point. And the second point is, what if we're serious about our external deficit, what do we need to do to remedy it? And he says, well, I hate to tell you what's obvious, but we need to bring down our massive fiscal deficit. As long as we have that massive fiscal deficit, we're going to have a lingering external trade deficit. And I'm going to show you this slide now, and I'm going to show you at the end, because this is what I'm trying to get across to you. And hopefully the next few slides will make that point clear. This is an image of the federal surplus if it were positive, but it's a deficit when it's negative. You're talking about regime change. There was a regime change beginning with the Nixon era in which the deficits as a fraction of GDP suddenly exploded to 3.5% to 4%. We had the Obama record deficit relative to GDP over there on the right, and the additional the $1 trillion deficit is going to be like a 5% of GDP. So it looks like Trump isn't going to defeat Obama in a sense. He's not going to get a deficit that's anywhere near. And in a sense, it's not that much bigger than we've had historically. A little bit more than another percentage point. That's the historical record. So now we have to talk about savings and investment. And this is the stuff that gets kind of obscure. So hopefully it'll stick with me. But this is a slide that shows you the blue or green or whatever the colors, that's gross savings as a share of GDP. And behind that is the red, that's the investment as a share of GDP. So when the investment is higher than the savings, our investments have to be funded by borrowing from foreigners. So that red difference between investment and savings, that's the external deficit. So that's a critical fact, that if you don't save enough internally to fund the investment opportunities that you have in your country, the foreigner is going to step in and fund those investments. And that's what we've been doing for a long time. And as we widen that fiscal deficit, we increase our indebtedness to the Chinese and the Germans, et cetera, all these countries around the world that run the trade surpluses. So, and who's responsible? These are forced savers. Households, household savings, personal savings is pretty low, abysmally low for an aging population, by the way. Like 7 or 8% savings is not adequate. Business savings has been pretty constant, it's about 3 or 4% of GDP. States used to run surpluses, and now they're starting to run deficits too. But the big malfeasor is Uncle Sam. It's like we gave our credit card to our uncle who has no income himself, and he's out there charging flat screen TVs and expensive wine, and we don't know that. We don't know that that's our liability at some point. And we need to do something about it, particularly the young people. We need an AAYP. I see there's a lot of prospective members of the American Association of Young People to offset the power of the AARP, because otherwise your taxes are going to go sky high in the future. There's like $100 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare. So here's the accounting. Here we're going to go into economics thinking. Maybe you've studied this before. It's sort of simple to economists, but incredibly complex to Peter Navarro and Donald Trump. GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. We teach that. We say it over and over. It's the way the economists read the alphabet. C is consumption spending. I is investment spending. G is government purchases of goods and services. It's mostly bureaucrats. It's not transfers. It's not Medicare and Social Security. Those are transfers. This is actually purchases of goods and services. And then there's net exports, which are exports minus imports. That's the way, that's an accounting identity which has to hold. They add it up, and that's how the GDP is measured. So then if you take that accounting identity and you move the C and I to the, or C and G to the other side, we get GDP, which is a measure both of sales but also total income in the economy, minus that which is spent on consumption, minus that spent on government. That's total gross savings in the economy. That's equal to I, which is investment locally, plus X minus M. X minus M is the accumulated claims on foreigners. When you sell more exports than you import, you get promises to pay later on. On the other hand, if your imports exceed your exports, what you're shipping is pieces of paper which are promised to pay later, which is the circumstances that we're in now. But the message is savings minus I is X minus M. The difference between savings and investment is X minus M. That was the slide that you had a minute before. But we can write this a little more completely in this next, well, I'm going to skip this because I don't really have the time. You can write this a little more clearly by adding taxes and transfers to the mix. So on the up above, I have GDP minus consumption minus taxes plus transfers. That's private savings, including the revenues from transfers, but subtracting the tax liability and putting that on the federal balance sheet. Up and to the right, you have taxes, which are the government revenues, minus government spending, minus the transfers that are going on. That's government saving. And then down below you have investment plus domestic investment plus net foreign investment. I don't know if you get this idea. X minus M, that's the current account. That's equivalent to a capital account because that represents accumulating claims on foreigners. That's why I'm calling it a foreign investment. So that's the key accounting identity. And then in my classroom, we go through this kind of hypothetical, which is suppose the government savings declines and you're trying to maintain this accounting identity is still operating. Something else has to change in order to prevent it from being violated. One possibility is that decline in the government savings is offset by an increase in private savings. Namely, we recognize there are these future liabilities on our balance sheets, so we offset this saving that Uncle Sam is doing by doing our own saving. That's called Ricardian equivalence. It's possible, it's not too likely. The way we do the accounting makes us all think that some magical person is going to pay those taxes in the future and not us. Another possibility is what's called crowding out, where the additional borrowing by the federal government increases interest rates, and that increased interest rate crowds out investment in houses and in equipment and in structures. But the third possibility is the net foreign investment turns negative. That's the twin deficit idea. So unless you're saved by Ricardian equivalence or you kill your economy by having less investment, we're going to be operating with the twin deficits, which is the most likely solution in the way I would suggest it. So conclusion, the current account deficit is about $500 billion a year. The treatment for that is more savings. Tell your uncle to stop using your credit card, especially if you're under 50. If you're 25 years old, you've got to be politically active and stop all this ridiculous deficit spending because it's on your balance sheet. And then it's the federal government that is really the big problem. And then here's the quotations again. I hope I got my point across that Gagnon is completely right about both these points. Tariffs are not going to change the deficit. And secondly, the correct remedy from the federal point of view would be to reduce the deficit and or increase private savings, for example, with heavily advantaged retirement accounts, tax advantaged retirement accounts, so you get the personal savings up a lot. Thank you very much.